When Maestro Alessandro Virtuoso saw Michael Jackson enter the Kennedy Center on December 15th, 1983, he couldn't hide his disgust. In front of Washington's most powerful people, he was about to make a mistake that would haunt him forever and reveal a secret the king of pop had hidden for 15 years. The Kennedy Center Honors Gala was Washington, D.C.'s most prestigious musical event. Politicians, diplomats, and classical music's greatest legends gathered annually to celebrate musical excellence and raise funds for the National Music Education Foundation. The guest list read like a who's who of American culture: senators, Supreme Court justices, Kennedy family members, and the most respected names in classical music. But that December night, there was an unexpected addition to the guest list. Michael Jackson, fresh off the unprecedented success of Thriller, had been invited because of his massive charitable contributions to music education programs. His presence, however, created an uncomfortable tension among the classical music elite who viewed him as nothing more than a pop entertainer. Alessandro Virtuoso, 68 years old and one of the most respected classical pianists of his generation, watched Michael's arrival with barely concealed contempt. Alessandro had performed at Carnegie Hall over 200 times, recorded with the Vienna Philharmonic, and dedicated his entire life to what he considered real music. To him, Michael Jackson represented everything wrong with modern culture: shallow entertainment masquerading as art. "Look at him," Alessandro whispered to his colleague, renowned violinist Margaret Sterling. "Sequined gloves and moonwalking. This is what passes for musicianship these days." Margaret tried to be diplomatic. "Alessandro, he's raised millions for music education. That's why he's here." "Money doesn't make you a musician," Alessandro replied coldly. "Any fool can write a catchy tune and dance around, but can he actually play an instrument? Can he read music? Does he understand the complexities of real composition?" What Alessandro didn't know was that Michael Jackson had been quietly nursing his own insecurities about exactly those questions. Despite selling over 40 million copies of Thriller and becoming the most famous entertainer on earth, Michael still felt defensive about his musical credibility. The criticism stung because, in many ways, it touched on his deepest fears about being taken seriously as an artist. As Michael moved through the reception, he was acutely aware of the whispered comments and sideways glances. "What's he doing here?" he heard someone mutter. "This is a serious music event," another voice added. Michael had faced skepticism before, but never in such a rarefied atmosphere where musical pedigree meant everything. The evening's program began with a series of classical performances. A string quartet played Mozart with precision and elegance. A soprano delivered a flawless aria from La Traviata. Then Alessandro himself took the stage to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, backed by the National Symphony Orchestra. Alessandro's performance was technically flawless and emotionally stirring. His fingers danced across the keys with the authority that comes from decades of disciplined practice. When he finished, the audience erupted in thunderous applause. This was classical music at its finest, performed by a master who understood every nuance of the composer's intention. But Alessandro wasn't finished. As the applause died down, instead of taking his bow and leaving the stage, he walked to the microphone. The audience quieted, expecting a gracious thank you speech. What they got was something very different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alessandro began, his voice carrying clearly through the Kennedy Center Concert Hall, "tonight we celebrate musical excellence. We honor those who dedicate their lives to the pursuit of artistic perfection through rigorous training, technical mastery, and deep understanding of musical tradition." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. He sensed where this was heading. Alessandro continued, his eyes scanning the audience until they found Michael. "But I see we have a celebrity in our midst tonight. Mr. Jackson, isn't it? From that pop group?" The words "pop group" were delivered with unmistakable disdain. The audience turned to look at Michael, some uncomfortable with the obvious targeting, others curious to see how this would unfold. "Now, I've always been curious about popular musicians," Alessandro said, his tone faux friendly but dripping with condescension. "So much spectacle, so much entertainment value. But where's the musicianship? Where is the technical skill that separates true artists from mere performers?" Michael remained seated, his jaw tight, but he didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that engaging with critics often made situations worse, but Alessandro wasn't done. Perhaps, Mr. Jackson, you'd be willing to demonstrate for us what popular musicians consider musical skill? We have this beautiful Steinway grand piano right here. Surely someone who calls himself a musician could manage a simple classical piece? The invitation was framed as a friendly challenge, but everyone in the room could hear the mockery beneath it. This was a public humiliation attempt, designed to expose Michael as the fraud Alessandro believed him to be. The pianist's smile was thin and cruel, the expression of a man who thought he was about to prove a point. Michael felt every eye in the Kennedy Center focused on him. His heart pounded as he realized he was trapped. If he declined the challenge, he'd be confirming Alessandro's implication that he wasn't a real musician. If he accepted and failed, he'd be humiliated in front of the most influential cultural figures in America. But then something unexpected happened. From across the room, a young voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, Maestro Virtuoso?" Everyone turned to see a young woman standing up in the balcony section. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with auburn hair and the confident posture of someone trained in classical performance. She wore a simple black dress with a small pin, identifying her as a Juilliard student. "Sir," she continued, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes now focused on her, "what you're doing isn't about musical excellence. It's about prejudice. Musical talent doesn't depend on genre, and what you're attempting is bullying, not education." Alessandro's face reddened. "Young lady, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," the student interrupted. "My name is Sarah Kennedy. I'm a piano performance major at Juilliard. I've studied classical music my entire life. I also happen to believe that dismissing an artist's abilities based on genre is ignorant and small-minded." The room buzzed with uncomfortable energy. A music student had just publicly challenged one of classical music's most revered figures. But Sarah wasn't finished. "Mr. Jackson has contributed more to music education in this country than most classical musicians ever will. His charitable work has funded music programs in dozens of schools. Maybe instead of questioning his credentials, we should be thanking him for his generosity." Alessandro sputtered, clearly unprepared for this defense. But before he could respond, Michael Jackson stood up. The room fell silent as the king of pop rose from his seat, adjusted his jacket, and began walking toward the stage. But what happened next would change Alessandro's understanding of music forever and reveal a secret that Michael Jackson had kept hidden from the world for over a decade. Michael reached the stage with measured steps, showing no signs of the nervousness that was churning in his stomach. As he approached the magnificent Steinway grand piano, Alessandro backed away slightly, suddenly uncertain about the confrontation he'd initiated. "Thank you for the invitation, Maestro," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the concert hall's perfect acoustics. "You're right that actions speak louder than words." Michael sat at the piano bench and ran his fingers lightly across the keys, testing the instrument's touch and tone. The room was absolutely silent, 2,000 people holding their breath to see what would happen next. What none of them knew was that Michael Jackson had been secretly preparing for this moment his entire life. Hidden behind the sequined gloves and moonwalking was a classical musical foundation that began in childhood and never stopped growing. It started at Motown in 1969, when Berry Gordy insisted that all his young artists learn musical fundamentals. While the Jackson Five rehearsed their choreography and vocal arrangements, Michael spent extra hours at the piano with Motown's classically trained instructors. He learned to read music, studied basic composition, and developed an appreciation for musical complexity that went far beyond pop sensibilities. Diana Ross, who became a mentor to young Michael, encouraged his classical studies. "Learn the rules before you break them," she'd tell him. "Understand what the masters did, then find your own voice." She arranged for private piano lessons with her own classical teacher during the Jackson Five's breaks from touring. Throughout the 1970s, while his brothers relaxed between concerts, Michael would find pianos in hotel lobbies and practice Bach inventions, Chopin nocturnes, and Beethoven sonatas. It became his private sanctuary, a way to connect with music on a deeper level than the entertainment industry demanded. He studied not for career advancement, but for personal fulfillment and artistic growth. None of this was ever publicized. Motown's image machine wanted the Jackson Five to appear young, fun, and accessible. Classical music didn't fit the brand, so Michael's piano studies remained his secret, shared only with a few close mentors and instructors who were sworn to discretion. By 1983, Michael had been quietly studying classical piano for 14 years. He'd reached a level of proficiency that would surprise anyone who knew him only through his pop persona. But he'd never performed classical music publicly, never revealed this aspect of his musicality, because he feared it might seem pretentious or confuse his image. Now, facing Alessandro's challenge, Michael made a decision that would change how the world saw him. He was going to reveal his secret. Maestro Virtuoso, Michael said, looking directly at his challenger, you mentioned technical skill and understanding of musical tradition. I'd like to perform Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor, third movement, the piece you probably know as part of the Moonlight Sonata. A murmur ran through the audience. The third movement of the Moonlight Sonata was one of the most technically demanding pieces in classical piano repertoire. It required lightning-fast fingerwork, precise timing, and deep musical understanding. Many professional pianists struggled with its complexities. Alessandro's eyes widened. He'd expected Michael to attempt something simple, maybe chopsticks or a basic folk melody. The third movement of the Moonlight Sonata was a piece that separated serious pianists from amateurs. If Michael failed, the humiliation would be complete. If he succeeded, Alessandro couldn't even contemplate that possibility. Michael placed his hands on the keyboard and, without further preamble, began to play. The opening measures of Beethoven's masterpiece filled the Kennedy Center with crystalline precision. Michael's fingers moved across the keys with the fluidity and accuracy that comes only from years of dedicated practice. The complex arpeggios that challenge even accomplished pianists flowed from his hands with apparent ease. The audience was stunned. This wasn't a pop musician struggling through a classical piece. This was a serious pianist performing one of the repertoire's most demanding works with technical mastery and artistic sensitivity. Alessandro's face went through a series of transformations. First, disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Then confusion as he tried to reconcile what he was hearing with his preconceptions about popular musicians. Finally, something approaching awe as he realized he was witnessing a performance of genuine quality. Michael poured everything he had into those 8 minutes of music. All the hours of secret practice, all the passion he'd kept hidden, all the musical understanding he'd developed in private came pouring out through his fingertips. He wasn't performing as Michael Jackson, the pop star. He was performing as Michael Jackson, the musician, sharing a side of his artistry that few people knew existed. The technical demands of the piece were extreme. Rapid-scale passages that required perfect finger independence, dynamic contrasts that tested musical sensitivity, rhythmic complexities that demanded absolute precision. Michael navigated them all with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering every detail. But beyond the technical achievement was something more profound. Michael's interpretation was deeply personal, filled with emotion and understanding that went far beyond mechanical execution. He understood Beethoven's intentions, the turbulence and passion that the composer had embedded in the music. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was channeling the composer's spirit. The audience sat in complete silence, transfixed by what they were witnessing. Politicians who barely understood classical music found themselves moved by the power and precision of Michael's performance. Professional musicians in the audience recognized they were hearing something extraordinary. Sarah Kennedy, the Juilliard student who had defended Michael, sat with tears streaming down her face. She understood better than anyone the level of skill being displayed. This wasn't just competent classical playing. This was artistry of the highest order. As Michael approached the climactic final section of the sonata, his intensity grew. The music demanded everything from the performer, technically and emotionally, and Michael gave it everything he had. His fingers flew across the keyboard with precision that defied belief, building to the thunderous conclusion that left the entire audience breathless. When the final chord resonated through the Kennedy Center, the silence was deafening. For nearly 30 seconds, 2,000 people sat in stunned quiet, processing what they had just experienced. Then slowly, individual audience members began to applaud. The first person to stand was Margaret Sterling, Alessandro's violinist colleague. Her applause was followed by others, and within moments, the entire Kennedy Center was on its feet in thunderous ovation. But the most significant moment came when Alessandro Virtuoso himself began to clap, his face showing a mixture of amazement and humility. Michael stood and took a simple bow, no theatrical gestures or pop star flourishes. He had proven his point not with words or arguments, but with music itself. As he prepared to leave the stage, Alessandro approached him. "Mr. Jackson," Alessandro said, his voice barely audible above the continuing applause, "I owe you an apology. What I witnessed tonight, I've heard that piece performed by some of the world's greatest pianists. Your interpretation ranks among the finest I've ever experienced." Michael looked at the older man with genuine compassion. "Thank you, Maestro. But this isn't about proving anyone wrong. Music doesn't belong to any one genre or group of people. It belongs to everyone who loves it enough to dedicate themselves to understanding it." Alessandro nodded slowly, the lesson hitting home. "You're absolutely right. I let my prejudices blind me to the possibility that talent comes in many forms." As the applause finally died down, something beautiful happened. Alessandro walked to the microphone and addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must confess something tonight. I challenge Mr. Jackson because I believe that popular musicians lack the training and dedication required for classical music. I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. What we just witnessed was not just technical mastery, but true artistic understanding. Mr. Jackson has reminded me that music is not about exclusion or superiority. It's about expression, emotion, and the human spirit." He turned to Michael, who was still standing near the piano. "Thank you for showing me that talent and dedication transcend genre boundaries. I would be honored to call you a fellow musician." The audience erupted once more, this time not just in appreciation for a performance, but in recognition of a moment of genuine human growth and understanding. After the gala, Michael sought out Sarah Kennedy, the young Juilliard student who had defended him. He found her in the lobby, still overwhelmed by what she had witnessed. "Sarah," Michael said, approaching her with a warm smile, "thank you for speaking up tonight. That took real courage." Sarah blushed slightly. "I just couldn't stand seeing someone being treated unfairly because of musical prejudice. What you did up there, I've never heard anyone play Beethoven like that outside of a concert hall." "You know," Michael said, "I've been thinking about starting a foundation to help young classical musicians from underprivileged backgrounds. Would you be interested in helping me develop that program?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Really? You'd do that?" "Music saved my life," Michael replied. "The least I can do is help it save others." That conversation led to the creation of the Michael Jackson Classical Music Education Foundation, which over the next decade would provide scholarships and instruments to hundreds of young classical musicians who couldn't otherwise afford formal training. Sarah Kennedy became the foundation's first program director, eventually earning her doctorate and becoming one of the most respected music educators in the country. But perhaps the most profound change that night was in Alessandro Virtuoso himself. The encounter with Michael completely transformed his worldview about music and musicians. He began incorporating popular music elements into his teaching, encouraging his students to explore different genres, and became an advocate for breaking down the artificial barriers between classical and popular music. 3 months after the Kennedy Center encounter, Alessandro did something unprecedented. He invited Michael to perform a classical pop crossover piece with the National Symphony Orchestra. The performance, which featured Michael playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with his own vocal interpretations woven throughout, became one of the most talked about musical events of 1984. The story of that December night spread through musical circles, though it was never widely reported in mainstream media. Musicians talked about it in whispers, the night Michael Jackson silenced his critics with Beethoven. Some versions became exaggerated over the years, but those who were actually there never forgot the truth of what they witnessed. For Michael, the performance represented something deeper than just proving his critics wrong. It was about honoring the musical foundation that had shaped him, acknowledging the teachers and mentors who had believed in his potential, and demonstrating that artistic excellence knows no boundaries. In later interviews, Michael would occasionally reference that night, though he never described it in detail. "People like to put music in boxes," he would say, But music doesn't live in boxes. It lives in hearts. Whether it's classical, pop, rock, or jazz, if it touches someone's soul, it's doing its job. Alessandro Virtuoso continued performing for another decade, but he always said that meeting Michael Jackson was the moment that made him a complete musician. He taught me that being a master of your craft isn't enough, Alessandro reflected years later. You also have to be master of your prejudices. The Steinway grand piano that Michael played that night still sits on the Kennedy Center stage. Piano technicians who service it occasionally mention that it seems to have a special resonance, as if that one performance left something behind in the instrument itself. Sarah Kennedy, now Dr. Sarah Kennedy, still teaches at Juilliard. In her office hangs a photograph from that December night. Michael at the piano, completely absorbed in Beethoven's music, with Alessandro watching from the side of the stage, his expression one of pure amazement. Below the photograph is a handwritten note from Michael, sent to Sarah a few days after their first meeting. Thank you for reminding me that standing up for what's right is always the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. Your courage inspired me to show a part of myself I'd kept hidden for too long. The note is signed simply, "Keep making beautiful music, Michael." Years later, when Michael's classical piano skills became more widely known, music historians would point to that Kennedy Center performance as a turning point in how the industry viewed crossover artists. It proved that musical excellence could exist in multiple genres simultaneously, that an artist could be both a pop icon and a serious musician. But for those who were there that night, the real impact wasn't about industry changes or historical significance. It was about witnessing a moment of pure human transformation when prejudice gave way to understanding, when assumptions crumbled in the face of talent, and when two very different musicians discovered they shared the same deep love for the power of music to move hearts and change minds. The piano challenge that was meant to humiliate Michael Jackson instead became a celebration of musical unity. Alessandro Virtuoso thought he was exposing a fraud, but instead discovered a fellow artist. And Michael Jackson, who had spent years hiding his classical training, finally found the courage to share all aspects of his musical soul with the world. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them, when challenge becomes opportunity, when prejudice transforms into respect, and when music reminds us that talent, passion, and dedication are the only credentials that truly matter. That December night at the Kennedy Center, a pop star became a classical pianist became a better human being, and everyone who witnessed it was reminded why music will always be humanity's most powerful, universal language.